What's up, Algebra Bros? In this video, what we're going to do is solve a couple of inequalities involving functions, particularly the graph of two functions. As you can see here, we are provided just graphs of functions f of x and g of x. And in part A, we want to figure out what values of x would solve g of x being greater than or equal to f of x. Alright, so what I would encourage you to do to solve or start solving something like this is to identify the points of intersection. It looks like there are 2 points of intersection between these two graphs. One appears to be at 1, 16, and the other point of intersection appears to be at 7, 4. And what I'd like to do with this information is just mark on the x-axis the x-coordinates of each of these points. So for instance, the first point of intersection I labeled was 1, 16, so I'm going to go to the x-axis and label 1 down there. And then the next point was 7, 4, so I'm going to go down to the x-axis and label the 7 there. So what I want to do next is just give you a way of interpreting the inequality symbols. Whether it's greater than or equal to, so greater than or equal to, this means, or you can think of this as the word above. And if we have less than or equal to, you can think of this as like the word below. So for instance, with part A, we want to solve the inequality g of x is greater than or equal to f of x. From a graphical standpoint, we want to figure out which part or parts of g of x are above the graph of f of x. So keep in mind, g of x is the red graph here. And if you look at the part of the graph of g of x that's between the points of intersection, this would be a part of the graph of g of x that's above the graph of f of x. Because visually speaking, that little red section of the line there is a little bit higher than the blue part that's underneath it. So that would be the piece to kind of focus on for part A. And in terms of writing the solution, we want to figure out what values of x correspond to that. And the values of x that correspond to that piece of the graph of g of x are exactly those between 1 and 7. So in this answer spot right here, we're going to use interval notation. We'll write 1, 7, and because there is a bar underneath this inequality symbol, that means we're allowed to include these values as part of our solution. So we're going to put a bracket on each of them. Alright, so that's how you can solve part A. Now for part B, the roles kind of changed a little bit. We want f of x this time to be above the graph of g of x. Okay, well, let's look at these points of intersection. I think they'll be a little more crucial this part. The first point of intersection, 1, 16. If you look to the left of this point, if you look at what's happening here, we start to see the positions of the graph sort of swap with each other in the sense that to the left of this point, 1, 16, the blue graph, which is the graph of f of x, appears to be a little bit higher than the graph of g of x. So that portion of the graphs is going to be important for us. And if you look at the point 7, 4, to the right of this point, we're also seeing the graph of f of x being above the graph of g of x. So those two parts of the graph of f of x are geometrically higher in the coordinate plane than those two parts of the graph of g of x. So for this inequality, we actually want what's on the outside of the numbers 1 and 7, so to speak. So in other words, the x values that correspond to the part to the left of 1, 16 are those from negative infinity all the way up to 1. and the x values that correspond to the points on the graph of f of x to the right of 7 comma 4 are those that are from 7 all the way up to positive infinity. So interval notation again, there's going to be two pieces. So negative infinity to positive 1 by default, parentheses on infinities, and there's no bar this time with the inequality symbol in part B, so we'll use a parenthesis around 1, and then we're going to union that with parentheses again, 7 comma positive infinity, and those would be the solutions for x for the inequality presented in part B. And that's for the pain and torture. I'm sorry, fun and excitement for this problem ends. Of course, if you have questions, feel free to let me know. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next video.